Hello and welcome to The Truth About Storytelling. I'm Tyreen Martinson, author, poet, podcaster, and creative explorer. I've published several novels, dozens of short stories, and over 100 poems across fantasy, sci-fi, and poetry genres. I'm here to share what I've learned along the way. On this podcast, I pull back the curtain on the writing life, the triumphs, the struggles, and everything in between. Whether it's a behind the scenes peek into my current projects, real world tips for writers and authors, or just some good old fashioned storytelling talk, I hope you'll find encouragement, inspiration, and a few practical takeaways. Each month, I also highlight special book deals and upcoming releases, so stick around for those updates at the end of the episode. Let's kick things off with an update on my writing, a peek behind the scenes of my current works in progress. First up, I have a poetry collection I've been revising with over 88 poems, and I'm also trying to collect around 40 more. It's been a bit humbling because I realize that some of my poems have been stuck in journals or on pieces of paper, and it's time to revise them and polish them and make them beautiful for that collection. I've already been through 88 poems, but again, I have about 40 more to do, and I've learned that I need to be a little more patient with my poems. So I'm taking some time to work on that. I'll be working on revising those poems and adding them to the poetry collection in a carefully curated way, probably once or twice a week. Meanwhile, I'm also working on a fantasy novel a couple of times a week, and I'm currently in the section in which I am on a sea-swept island. The characters have been racing around there trying to find clues about something that I'm not going to mention. We'll just say that they are on an island and they're experiencing a different culture. It feels very familiar to them and very foreign at the same time. It's been challenging for me to write, but it's also been a lot of fun. There's been a bit about sailing in there, and since I live in an area where there's quite a bit of ocean water nearby, I enjoy writing about the ocean and about water and scenes in which my characters are on boats. It's just kind of fun. And so I've been having fun with both of those projects. I've also been working on a short story collection for one of my pen names, and I've been doing that once or twice a week as well. Now, what I do to juggle projects like that is I have time blocks in which I work for 4 hours at each project for each day. Sometimes I try to get in 6 hours, but typically 4 hours is as much writing and revision work as I can get done. So I will switch up which project I'm working on, usually every couple of days. And that's just a process that makes me feel happy and joyful as a writer. I know for some writers that would really bother them, but for me, I love having time blocks and I love moving from one project to the next, especially when they're not the same exact type of genre. So working on a poetry collection and then a fantasy novel and then a series of short stories for a pen name, they're different enough to me that I find them kind of fun to work on from one to the other at different times. So in my next section in this podcast, I want to delve into an area that has been really important to me, an area of writing and story that I have just seriously enjoyed and kind of loved for many years. In fact, I think since I was about 5 years old, I've been passionate about this particular area of storytelling. And I gave you a little bit of hint in last week's episode about what it would be. So without further ado, I'm announcing a 4 to 5 week series on swords and sword fighting in films and books. And you may think, wow, there's a lot of lead up for swords and sword fighting, but I love action scenes in movies and in books, and I've loved them since I was a kid, since I read fairy tales, since I watched the animated version of Peter Pan, which I'm not going to say the sword fighting in that was like anything realistic at all. Of course, it wasn't. It was an animated film with, Peter Pan and Captain Hook. But I also loved Star Wars, and I saw that when I was 6. Star Wars New Hope. I got to see the battle scene between Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and I just thought that was really cool. So I have been enamored with swords and sword fighting in film and in fiction and stories, in novels. Again, since I was a very young child, I just thought it was really cool to watch people, battle between good and evil and overcome hardship and all that sort of thing. So I really wanted to do a series of podcast episodes about swords and sword fighting, even though I know that's maybe not everybody's favorite thing. But hopefully, if you stick around, you'll hear a little bit about why it's one of my favorite things, and maybe I can bring you over to the sword side of fiction a little bit, and hopefully, so you could enjoy action scenes maybe even a little bit more than you do already. So, why are so many people obsessed with thrilling action movies with sword fight scenes or combat scenes in them? Well, I'm going to speak specifically to swordplay today. I believe that swordplay offers a perfect mix of symbolism, spectacle, and story. It can be deeply personal to the characters, unlike long range weapons. Although I will say that I happen to love The Ranger's Apprentice, and I'll come back to that in a later episode about combat and weapons use in general. In The Ranger's Apprentice, the main character uses a longbow, and it's a fascinating series about characters in a fantasy world. But swords demand the characters get up close. It's visceral and intimate for characters to be in a sword fight. And it actually makes that a great time for character development. So I started doing some research about sword fighting in films and books, and I found some interesting things out there about why combat remains such a powerful element in storytelling across time. So let's look at some key aspects that make sword and sword fighting so captivating in our story. Swords aren't just sharp pieces of metal. They represent something deeper in our storytelling. Throughout history, swords have symbolized power, authority, and character. Think about it. Learning to use a sword properly took years of dedicated training and considerable resources, which naturally made swordplay the domain of warriors and nobles. The exclusivity is why we're still drawn to legendary blades like Excalibur or the carefully crafted katana of Japanese tradition. These weapons become extensions of their wielders' identities and often embody concepts like justice, honor, and legitimate rule. What really sets sword combat apart is its intimacy. Unlike firing an arrow or using a spear, swords demand close quarters engagement where opponents can see each other's eyes. This creates incredible dramatic tension in stories. The sword literally becomes a character's constant companion, worn at the hip, drawn in moments of crisis, and used in those high-stakes personal confrontations that make for riveting storytelling. The versatility of swords also makes them perfect for exciting fight sequences. They can slash, thrust, parry, and adapt to different situations, giving storytellers endless possibilities for creating memorable combat scenes. Sword duels work brilliantly as physical manifestations of deeper conflicts. The best sword fights in stories aren't just about the clash of steel, they're about the clash of wills, ideologies, and character arcs reaching their climax. I love how sword fights allow for those dramatic moments where combatants pause to exchange words or revelations, adding layers to the conflict. Think about any great sword fight scene. It's usually as much about what's being said or realized as it is about the actual combat moves. Now, there's also something fundamentally exciting about watching skilled sword combat on film that transcends cultural boundaries. Almost every human civilization has developed its own sword traditions and accompanying legends, from European knights to Japanese samurai to Persian warriors. The universal appeal taps into our desire for agency and triumph against odds. Whether grounded in historical realism or stylized for pure entertainment, sword combat continues to provide that thrilling combination of danger, skill, and heroism that audiences crave. That's why, even in our era of advanced technology and modern weaponry, the sword continues to hold a special place in our stories and imaginations. Now, before I go on to my next segment about swords and sword fighting, I want to make sure you understand that I did some deep research. I did read different articles at different websites. I have fenced with the fencing club in the past. I've taken lessons. I've watched fencing matches and sword fighting duels with the Creative Anachronism Society that puts on big medieval fairs. I have enjoyed watching sword fighting and learning about sword fighting in various ways. And I've even been to fight classes for writers at Comic-Con and at other events like Realm Makers. But when I went to do this podcast, I started doing more and more research and digging into my notes. And I decided also to use a little bit of Perplexity AI. So if you want to know more about Perplexity AI, please go ahead and click the link in the show notes. But I want to make sure that I'm open and honest with you about where I found the information that I am sharing with you today. Although some of it also is based on my own opinion and my own experiences. All right, so this next section about sword fighting and swords in storytelling is all about the key differences between real sword fighting and choreographed sword fighting for film and books. So, movie and stage sword fights are carefully choreographed to look visually impressive and to keep actors safe. The goal is to create extended dramatic exchanges that are easy for audiences to follow and enjoy. But in a real sword combat, the objective is to end the fight as quickly and efficiently as possible. Actual sword fights are often brief, direct, and brutal, with little of the back and forth that we see in movies. Now, interestingly enough, when I was in fencing club, I had many people who came to fencing club who started learning how to fence who thought it would be choreographed like it was in the movies. And even though I was asked by my coach to help coach when I only had about a year of experience as a fencer with foil and only a few months of experience with saber, I did know just from fencing, like the Olympic style of fencing, that really you don't have room for extra moves in that space. Even when you're trying to get points in the Olympic style fencing, you don't have room for wild arm movements. You just have to go straight to your goal. And so, even though I would not say that Olympic style fencing is the same as real sword combat, it actually is closer to real sword combat than choreographed film and book type sword combat. So it's kind of interesting. I feel like there's three different types out there in the world. There's choreographed, there's Olympic style, and then there's the real sword combat. So in films, actors intentionally avoid hitting each other, using systems and rehearsed moves to simulate danger without causing harm. The action is slowed down and exaggerated for clarity and spectacle. Real sword fighters and fencers aim to strike their opponent and win, often wearing protective gear if sparring, but with genuine intent to hit. Even when you're an Olympic style fencer, you are fencing to get the hit. You're fencing to get the point. And so you don't do extra moves. You just go right straight to the target. So in movies, they often show combatants clashing swords repeatedly, blocking large sweeping attacks, and parrying with the edge of the blade. These actions are visually dramatic, but not practical or historically accurate. In real combat, parries are minimal and efficient, usually done with the flat of the blade to avoid damaging the edge. Fighters rarely block with their swords unless absolutely necessary, preferring to dodge or use shields. Now, again, I'm going to make that mention of fencing. In fencing, parries are still done with the flat of the blade, but fighters in fencing will block with their swords because they don't have shields in a fencing match. So, with duration and pacing, film sword fights are drawn out with long exchanges, pauses for dialogue, and dramatic tension-building moments. In fencing, you don't have that. Often, fencers will face off with each other, and simply by a shift of their shoulders or a tilt of their chin, they may be trying to intimidate their opponent, but there is no time for speech. And in real sword fights, especially duels, they were typically over in seconds, with little opportunity for drawn-out exchanges, and the first successful hit often ended the fight, either with injury or death. So that real sword fights were a lot gorier than what you would see in a film or in a book. So when you think about the physicality and the armor that goes on with edged weapons, when we watch a movie, we see armored fighters potentially depicted as slow or clumsy, and sometimes, occasionally, it's pretty rare, swords easily cutting through armor, which is kind of silly. So in reality, trained fighters in armor were fairly agile because they trained with that armor. And swords were generally ineffective against full plate armor except at weak points like in the armpit, at the neck, knees, legs, that type of thing. So film swordplay often borrows from theatrical traditions, including exaggerated movements, spinning, and dramatic flourishes that are really fun to watch on stage. I have to agree that they're fun to watch on stage. I've seen several Shakespeare plays with great combat sequences on stage. I love them. But when you look at historical fighting, flourishes are just not practical, because in real sword fights in historical times, the people involved were focused on survival and efficiency, not showmanship. But I don't want to end this podcast with feeling bummed out about how the fact that, historical swordplay is nothing like film swordplay. I actually want to celebrate some of the sword fights that we see in films and in books. I think that sword fighting and action are just fun to watch in films, and it's fun to read about in a book, especially if the author does that very specific dance of creating combat situations without getting gory, which is a tough line to walk when you're doing a sword fighting scene. So this week, because of that, I'm mainly going to focus on my 4 favorite film sword fights. So, first up, we have The Princess Bride with Inigo Montoya versus the Man in Black. Now, what makes this duel memorable is it's legendary not just for its awesome fight choreography, but for the wit, banter, and mutual respect between the fighters. As they trade blows, they also trade clever lines and gradually reveal their personalities. It's not just about swordplay, it's about character development through combat. And that tone in that scene is playful, intelligent, and character driven. But if you know anything about sword fighting, especially choreographed sword fighting, it is one of the most excellently choreographed sword fight scenes on film. I highly recommend it. Not because it's historically accurate at all, but because it is an awesome piece of fight choreography. And if you've ever been involved in Olympic style fencing or seen medieval style fencing at a Ren fair, I gotta tell you, it is a treat to watch. My second favorite fight scene has a lot of things in common with that my favorite. And my second favorite fight scene is from Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl with Jack Sparrow versus Will Turner. So what makes it memorable? It is a perfect example again of theatrical swordplay that uses every part of the environment, balancing on beams, swinging from ropes, knocking over barrels. It's chaotic, funny, and full of unexpected twists that reflect both characters' personalities and the film's over the top adventure tone. It's high energy, unpredictable, swashbuckling fun. Now, the other thing about it is, again, if you're into fencing, if you're into sword play and sword fight choreography, it is one of the most excellently choreographed sword fights on film. And there's a reason why these two are my top two favorite sword fights of all time. They were both choreographed by Bob Anderson, who lived between 1922 and 2012. He was a British Olympic fencer and swordmaster. He choreographed sword fights for The Princess Bride, Pirates of the Caribbean, The Lord of the Rings, The Mask of Zorro, Star Wars, and many more. He even doubled as Darth Vader in lightsaber scenes. So if you like great sword fighting scenes, check out all the sword fights that are choreographed by Bob Anderson, Olympic fencer and swordmaster. His style emphasized both dramatic flair and believable technique, blending storytelling with precise, visually striking action. And that is so awesome. I loved when I found that out about the combination of The Princess Bride and the Pirates of the Caribbean and the Star Wars movies. I was like, no wonder why I love these sword fights. They are all choreographed by the same sword master. And by the way, if you've reached a particular level of sword fighting technique as a fencer, you do become a sword master. Not a swordsman, a sword master, or a maestro. But next up, even though I love Star Wars, my third favorite fight scene is one that I watched in early childhood. It was an Errol Flynn film, The Adventures of Robin Hood, with Robin Hood versus Sir Guy of Gisborne. And what makes it memorable? It is classic Hollywood sword fighting. Elegant, super exaggerated, and full of flair. The duel is more about showmanship than realism, with grand poses and dramatic lunges. Errol Flynn set the standard for cinematic sword heroes, and his style still influences action choreography today. And again, if you've never seen the film, it's old, it's cheesy, but I watched it when I was a little kid because it would come on sometimes after Saturday cartoons, and I thought it was so much fun to watch. And it really was one of the reasons that I loved sword fighting as a kid. So, fourth up on my list of favorite sword fighting film cinematic moments is The Alchemy of Souls, Season 1, Episode 4, the fight between John Ook and the Prince. Now, I just watched this scene recently, so I'm going to say it's a recent favorite. It's set in a Korean fantasy drama. that brings a fresh take on sword duels, blending sleek choreography with magic infused action and emotional stakes. In episode 4, Yang Uk challenges the prince in a duel that tests not just skill, but honor and identity. The choreography is smooth and fast, and the scene stands out for its fusion of traditional swordplay with fantastical elements and character tension. Now, one of the things I really loved about watching that scene is that for me, because I'm a fantasy writer who writes about these powerful blades that have magical qualities, it felt just very resonant with the way I think about sword fighting in my own novels. And I haven't watched the rest of that series, so I don't know how it ends. I don't know if other people would love it or not. I know I saw it listed somewhere in like top 10 Korean fantasy dramas, so I think it is pretty popular. And I highly recommend if you like Korean fantasy drama, check it out on Netflix. It's an interesting and fun watch, especially if you like fantasy sword fighting. There's many other fantasy sword fights in the series, but for some reason, that one just really stood out to me, and I think it's partly because of what's going on with the characters in that scene. So, again, sword fights in fiction are as much about character driven tension and dialogue and what's going on with the character internally, as well as the actual sword fighting that's taking place. The sword fighting itself is like a mirror for the internal conflict of what's going on with the character. And that's one of the things I love about sword fighting in film and in books. So, weirdly, although I love to read and I always want to encourage and celebrate reading, I am not as much of a fan of the books behind The Princess Bride and The Adventures of Robin Hood. And the others, Pirates of the Caribbean and The Alchemy of Souls, don't have book beginnings. But I do love action adventure in books and in the movies made from them. For example, in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I love it when Bilbo gets to name Sting in The Hobbit. I love the name of that sword. I think it's so cool that Bilbo gets a sword. And I love the way that Bilbo overcomes his fears and becomes this courageous and wonderful character by the end of the book. But I also love the visual, visceral, and emotionally charged swordplay that I see in the Lord of the Rings films, which is heightened by Howard Shore's music and the character close-ups. And Howard Shore's music, yeah, and Peter Jackson's films. And I love it when I see characters like Legolas and Eowyn become fully involved in a fight scene and how they choreograph those fight scenes, how those film sequences are shot. As it's just brilliant. Peter Jackson did a brilliant job on the Lord of the Rings movies, and I actually, even though I know it's not exactly like the Hobbit book, I still love all three Hobbit movies. And it's kind of interesting because it's like I hold space in my head for both of those, because The Hobbit is one of my favorite books of all time. So you would think I would just be adamantly opposed to anything that was different that called itself The Hobbit. But I hold the Hobbit trilogy of films in almost a slightly separate space in my head, and that I enjoy them as something similar but not the same as the book. And I don't know how I could do that, except for many years ago I had watched, I think, a fourth or fifth rendition of Cinderella on film, and I thought, I don't mind it if I watch a different Cinderella story. I don't mind if I read a different Cinderella story. I enjoy the similarities between them. I enjoy the nuances and the differences between each of those versions. So why can't I do that with book to movie adaptations? And so I started thinking about ways I could. So I actually enjoy some books just as they are, as I picture them as my imagination, in my imagination, and then I picture, and then I also love their movie counterparts, even if they're not the same. So I invite you to consider if you can do that, if you can hold space in your imagination for both a book version and a movie version. Now, I know sometimes it's hard to do that. I know I really, really dislike the first movie adaptation of Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. Uh, but I do know that again, it's possible to hold a book and a movie in your head at the same time and enjoy both even when they're different. So in the books, Tolkien sometimes summarizes battles rather than showing blow by blow action. And in the film, you get the fully detailed action sequence. So in the books, the focus in Tolkien's books especially is more on the weight and consequences of war, what it means, how it changes people, and the ancient sense of fate behind every conflict. Individual duels in his books are rare and usually not highly detailed, but there are moments like Eowyn's slaying of the Witch King that still hit with enormous symbolic power. So I think that the emotional stakes, the cost of fighting, and what it says about each character is deeper in the books. And that's, I think, something that we see in books that we don't always see in films. Sometimes we do see deep character development and we see characters wrestling with consequences of their action in films. But I feel like books, because the way we read them, whether we read them silently or we listen to an audible book, they kind of hit us in a different way. They hit our hearts and our brains in a different way. They live with us a little bit longer. And they kind of haunt our hearts. And films, I think, can do that as well, but they're just a different part of the spectrum of storytelling. And so I want to encourage you this week to expand your experience of book to movie adaptations. And if you've seen a movie of something but haven't read the book, I invite you to check out the book. And if you've read the book of something and haven't seen the movie, I invite you to check out the movie. Especially if those books have some awesome sword fighting scenes in them. Compare the scene between the battle or the duel that appears in both book and film, like in Helm's Deep. Use your story journal to jot down what's different, what the book emphasized versus the movie, and which version moved you more. You can also reimagine a sword fighting scene from a book or movie and reimagine it in your mind, reimagine how you would sketch it out creatively, make a mini collage or write a quick retelling from another character's perspective. It could be kind of fun to play with it like that. You could also, even though soundtracks to awesome movies like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and Princess Bride and other movies, Pirates of the Caribbean, are amazing, you could also think about how you would choose to do a soundtrack for those scenes. Especially if it's a book that hasn't been made into a movie yet. I think that's a little bit easier. Now, if you're feeling really adventurous this week, look up some basic fencing or longsword tutorials on YouTube. Understanding a few of the moves or stances can make reading duels or sword fighting scenes much more immersive and even help you appreciate the films on a whole nother level. So, again, I highly recommend you check out a book to movie adaptation or even a movie to book adaptation. Those are out there. And if you can, rewatch a favorite fight scene with the book version in hand or in mind. And ask yourself, what emotional or symbolic layers does the book have versus what the film has? And see if you think they're the same or different. So reading and film, I think, don't have to compete. They can build on each other. And by engaging with stories in multiple ways, we don't just consume them, we can connect with them. And I think connection is the most important part. All right, so that's it for today's episode. Thank you for joining me on this journey through sword fights on screen and on the page. I hope it's inspired you to pick up a book, revisit a favorite film, or maybe even start your own story journal to capture the moments that spark your imagination. Next week, we're diving into something a little different, but just as legendary. I'll be talking about iconic swords and enchanted objects from Excalibur to Anduril, and I don't think I'm saying that right, and how certain weapons and relics in books and films become symbols we share across generations. We'll explore what makes them powerful in story and why they live on in our imagination as part of a shared creative heritage. I'll also have a few reflections on writing and rest, how taking breaks can refuel your creativity, again, and a fresh idea to encourage readers who love books full of deep research and rich lore. If you're someone who enjoys losing yourself in legends, myths, or historical depth, this one will hopefully be for you. Until then, keep reading, keep imagining, and maybe keep your sword arm limber. If you like this episode, please subscribe or give this podcast a review. You can find my books at online stores, and I'm currently taking part in 2 book funnels, giving away Dark Secrets, a prequel novella to the Darkblade trilogy, and Champion in the Darkness, the first book in the Champion trilogy. Find links for those giveaways in the show notes. Oh, and as I mentioned last week, I always want to encourage you to read. And my idea for encouraging people to read, hopefully you heard in that bit about comparing books to movies. But if you didn't hear it strong enough, please go out and read a story, read a book, read a picture book, read a fairy tale. Because fairy tales often have action sequences in them that are very brief, but can be fully fleshed out and imagined on film. And there are definitely some fairy tale story to film adaptations out there. So until next week, happy writing, happy reading, and happy film watching.